Welcome aboard. This is our first kick at having a talk around folk art, a broad topic, but we would like to bring something to the table, maybe once a month or perhaps every 6 weeks. And this venue suits us right now at this time of the year. We'll see what dead of winter amounts to. But for now, we're very grateful to Peter and Dorothy who allow us to use this space. And it's convenient for most all of us to get to. So this is the Folk Art Society of Nova Scotia. We're doing a little twist on our name. We haven't registered with joint stocks, but we'll think of it in those terms. Folk Art Society of Nova Scotia, and our goal and ambition is to have a folk art center, museum, based here in Lunenburg area, where we can have a permanent collection of both traditional and contemporary folk art, representative of the Nova Scotia artists over the years, including those who went to sea in ships and came home with their macrame and their decorated sea chests and scrimshaw and whatever, right up until today, where we have a propane tank that looks like a pig. Well, I have one anyway. So that's the goal and objective, and that's why we have a bit of a price tag on today, just so that we can accumulate some funds and that we can apply to CRA for our charitable standing, so that we can take larger donations to help underwrite this initiative. So based on that, we have our purposes there printed out if you would like to take with in case you're talking to someone else. And then our membership in the society is annual, $10, and if you sign up, that puts you on an email list and keeps you up on this sort of a happening. And we just reach out to all friends. So to that end, this gentleman has agreed to be the #1 speaker. Well, he's #1 on so many fronts, but he's our first speaker. And I'm sure 99.9% of you know Gordon. And we really appreciate it. He's Mr. Folk Art in terms of Nova Scotia Folk Art Festival, promoting, talking about, building up, and generally supporting folk art in Nova Scotia and abroad. So without saying too much more, he's obviously brought some pieces, and he'll speak to those. Yes?
Gordon, you come up in the world. Last night you were #2.
It's true. It's true. But things
He's
change.
#1 today, could be easily demoted. It happens just like that. But he's definitely #1.
24 hours, there you go. I think talk about 3 different areas. A little understanding of folk art, its presence in Nova Scotia, and a little bit about the history of the Folk Art Festival overall. I know we want to have a question period at the end, but if you feel the urge to ask a question on the way through, it may be worthwhile because it might spur some other memories in the bank up here, so we can let it flow. So feel free to holler out a question at any time through. And nothing is definitive when we're saying, talking here, and I mention things. It's not the final thing. There's lots of flexibility in the word folk art. Pretty much like the word love. It's very flexible, different definitions, etc. So we'll kind of move on from there. And I brought a few pages to kind of explain differentials and kind of maybe some history and some background and some little odds and ends from early festival and stuff like that. So let's just start with the official library index of what folk art is, and this is how they describe it. Folk art can be described as the art that is of the people, for the people, and by the people. Sounds like a constitution. These artists are interested in making art that tells stories about their daily life or the culture of their community. And that's part of that really rings pretty true overall. If we look at some of the folk art that we've kind of seen around here, and certainly this area has a lot of, Nova Scotia has a lot in Canada, a lot over the US. And I would refer probably to the index book of somewhere here of the history of folk art in Canada. Folk art artists was a book I think was done in the late 80s, early 90s. Worthwhile taking a look at, so you get a picture of what the folk art looks like across Canada, and also describes a bit what they think folk art is. Sometimes not the same as I think, but it's interesting again how the definition of folk art varies. But it gives it quite a good cross section. There's quite a few early examples of people here from Nova Scotia in that, and almost all of these people were at our folk art festival at one time or another, which is kind of interesting overall. It's work that's generally not refined. It's not trained artists. It's from the experience of the artists themselves, generally speaking overall. Today's folk art is, the definition is stretched a little bit. From the early days, it was pretty easy. When we started the festival up, the folk art was pretty clear. It was pretty traditional folk art. You never thought. But by a few years in, people were saying, I'm a folk artist, I want in. So the person we had hired to work done was some of our full-time Robin and Pat Wiley, and they were kind of the shepherds helping us through. They were the only ones that ever got paid ever. Good for them, but they worked hard at doing it. But this is their definition of to qualify for the annual Folk Art Festival. The artist must have a serious attitude toward his or her work. It should be unsophisticated. It should be unique. It should have good appeal, and it should be humorous or other qualities that the viewer can identify with. So that was the kind of filter. And then they had the no list. And the no list was no pattern work, no toll painting, no mass production, no underworked natural objects, and absolutely no cute. So, I think that was 1993, that filter was kind of entered in, because if I remember correctly that year, we looked at 30 pieces of work, narrowed it down to 12, and only 8 people got in eventually. So you can see that by then a lot of people wanted to be part of the folk art movement as artists, but weren't necessary in the folk art in the folk art world so well. So right away you could see the definition of folk art was expanding overall. Someone asked me to describe, how would the shortest term how you describe, and I used the terminology heart, head, and hand. It came from the heart, you thought about it, and then you did what you did, kind of thing in the hand. And oddly enough, that's the same motto as the College of Art and Design in Nova Scotia, which I graduated from, so I must have remembered something from my past. Heaven knows I remember things. And I think originally its primitive nature drew a lot of people, a lot of interest in folk art, and I think that a lot of people are attracted to that, the naivety of folk art and its primitive looking ways or exaggerations or things like that. That was the deal that came overall. And there was quite a crossover between antiques and folk art, and I think antique dealers were the first people that were really involved in folk art. And I was involved in antiques from very early in my life. I had loved antiques and bought, and as my wife tells me, with 4 or 5 barns later full of shit, as she says. It resonates and rings a bell. But we were buying things in folk art that we didn't call folk art. They were traditional, probably decorative arts we would be associated with. And I bring a couple of examples like this. This is a pocket watch bought from the 1800s. But it's not so much the box, it's the carving that's in here that really is attractive overall. And that's a folk art, a definition of a piece of a folk art overall. So it's very definitive that they were a very primitive carving in that. And you'll see that a lot in a lot of different ways throughout Lunenburg County. You'll see it on fishing boxes, handles on fishing boxes, some whirligigs you'll probably see, very early ones, not the contemporary ones, but early ones. You'll see them in fine little details like carvings and that in a little frame like that, little detail work. Lawn ornaments you'll find them on. So there's lots of examples around like that this decorative art was really a folk art expression that people used to see overall, and that was very, very common, and you'd see it everywhere. In some areas, like the Lunenburg area, was a fishing area, so you saw more reflective in things that would end up to be like, look like a fish or a carving of a rope or things that used to happen in those ways. So there was quite a bit of a crossover that. So in early days, I used to buy folk art, and this is a good example. I bought this as an antique. I didn't buy it as a piece of folk art, but now I know it as a piece of folk art. So it's kind of an interesting way. One that an old friend used to keep trying to buy from me for many, many years. And we'll talk about him later. And then I think there's examples of what folk art is today, and I'm kind of bringing it a little bit forward just to say that there's what we call the true blue folk artists. And those are traditional artists that really carve from the, the kind of head, heart, and hands there. And the one with the eagle down the end, I think, is Stanley Rector from up Cumberland County way. He carved, everything was one piece of wood. He made amazing carving. I have pictures, entire pictures that look like a painting in one piece of wood, just all carved up, beautiful stuff. And that's like to me, like a true, what I call the true blue folk artist. I'm going to say Charlton can't remember the first guy's name, and the next was a deer. Ken, thank you. And I have quite a few primitive pieces of his and a few painting, and he's just some wonderful folk art. And this painting here, by Carol Sloan-Waite, and I have quite a number of, this is extremely primitive, but it's very, very interesting with the animals sitting on top of and just the tall pieces of trees, just her interpretation of it. And she did wonderful paintings with beautiful painted frames and stuff like that. And these are like what I call the real amazing true blue kind of artists overall. And then we have artists that were we call copycats or crossovers, and some go on to develop further. And this would be a good example of that. This is one of the Nogler families, one of the sons, and he started out mimicking his family's work, but he actually ended up to develop his own little style all by himself. And most of his stuff are owls, and this is a kind of a pretty little piece with a kind of a bowl owl on top and bottom. And we bought quite a few pieces of his in our collection, and we have them actually displayed in our house. And I thought that's a good example of how an artist got influenced by another one. He still carves primitively in his own way, but he definitely was influenced by the expression that it was in the family. And of course, everybody knows the Noglers. If you're a folk artist and don't have a Nogler piece in your house, you're not really a folk artist collector, basically, because that's kind of where it started overall. So, and there's a lot of people like that. Another example would be, and you heard the mention about what is folk art and what is not, with the do list and no pattern stuff. So this is one that would be considered not folk art. It's a lovely piece. We bought it. Di and I bought it from Chris Huntington out of his house, his studio, and I liked it, and Chris liked it enough to buy it. He bought it off of somebody's lawn, and he mounted it on a little piece of, actually what was part of a railway tie that had been washed up on the shore, and he trimmed it down and put it on. But we both liked, I think, the painting and kind of whimsical painting it was on. Again, not a true piece of folk art, but that whimsical painting made it really nice, so it kind of falls in that category. So that's why I say there's like a gray area there. It really very challenging sometimes to find out where that definitive line is overall. It's easy to find the definitive line on really good early folk art, but as it transitions and moves along through the period, then I think that those lines get a little bit blurred overall. And that's kind of I think enough of the background of folk art. I think you get a sense of that, and if you have any burning questions, throw them out right now. No burning, no fires.
Your little ducks
I was going to say those later, but I'll throw them little ducks now. No. So it's presence in Nova Scotia. So folk art has been around for a long time in Nova Scotia, and I think I mentioned about all the antique dealers all had folk art. They just didn't know it was called folk art. It never really knew that it was folk art. And generally, I think most of the folk art that we normally first see in the early, what I call the first wave, was influenced either by the fishing industry, the forest industry, or agricultural industry. Those seem to have the themes that people carved, painted, knitted, hooked, whatever. They kind of did that in those influence areas, and plus there's a lot after that, but those seem to be the primary areas. So that goes back to really the definition where people really talk about their roots and their community that they lived in overall. And these people had time in their hands. You know, the lumber guy who was in the woods working then was just tired. He'd just take a piece of wood and start carving a bird out of it, or a bear, or hacking with a chainsaw, cutting a bigger bear, and that's how they started. If you look at some of the Nogler family, that's exactly how they started. They were woods people, and they just went on from there in their spare time.
Would they have painted that then at the time, like you know, the earlier, like the people that were logging and just sort of chipping away? Would they also paint what they carved?
A lot of, yes, a lot of them did. The very early stuff, I think you'll find a lot of black and white. But a notorious note on the #1 buyer of car paint from Canadian Tire in Bridgewater were the Nogler family. So that tells you a lot about the color side overall. So they were big buyers of the heavy duty paint. So the common themes, and again going back to the area, and as a general rule, I find that most of the stuff was rural. It really came from the rural area. There were city producers, there were folk art people here, but not very many of them. And that down here is a good example. That's Joe Sleep. And Joe Sleep has a wonderful repertoire of his work, and lots of paintings in him, and there's a little booklet here if you want to take a peek after on Joe Sleep's stuff. It's really wonderful. He had some amazing colors and stuff like that. And there's a great one, I think the gallery up in the Eastern Shore. Yes, Black Sheep thing. I wanted to call it the Wild Goose, but it was close. She had in her newsletter, I think in the fall or winter, had one where she had a clip of Joe, in his house, talking, and they had to scan the room around the pictures like that. This was one of the ones that was on the wall at the time, but it was an early recording. But he's a good example of that kind of work and era. But again, a city one. We don't see much coming out of the high density populated areas. It really came from a rural influence, but he was a good example. There are other examples, but he was the best and most obvious one that we could find. I think certainly wouldn't be without talking about Chris Huntington. Now, I met Chris in 1985, and if somebody said who's the most influential character for folk art, I wouldn't hesitate. It would be Chris Huntington. He's not the father of folk art, but he is the founder of folk art for many of us, in the sense that he actually found folk art and brought it out into the light, and priced it and moved it up and valued it and did a lot of things that really brought it out as a kind of a real section by itself. Chris was primarily an antique dealer. He was educated as a painter and studied 17th, 18th century paintings, so he was very knowledgeable. He was a very good painter. We bought a few of his paintings of the year, and when he couldn't paint very much, he'd come back and he'd buy the painting back and pay you twice as much as you paid for it. He then, of course, sold it for 4 times more than that, but Chris was also a very good businessman, very sharp. So his influence was amazing overall. I first met him just on the antique side, because he was antique pickers were going through Lunenburg County for years. Chris could go through a house and an antique picker said nothing left in that house. He'd go through and he'd find something. He'd not only find one thing, he'd probably find 6 or 7 really good things. And that's what he had an eye for. He just had this eye. He could see the corner of a chest or the edge of a tin or the edge of a bowl on the cupboard. Whatever it was, he just was like a magnet to it. And through that, he actually found out that he was finding a lot of folk art. And he was more familiar with the folk art side from being from the United States. And so he started buying this folk art, like a lot of it, and I mean a lot. He wouldn't go by with his truck with a license plate bourbon on it. and he managed to slop back a little bit of bourbon every now and then, or every day, if you might want to call it that way. But it probably helped him through his process, I think, to some degree overall. So he amassed quite a collection very, very quickly. I would say within 2 years he had probably 400 or 500 pieces anyway, spread out. And then he started a gallery. The gallery, I think it was called the Wild Goose Gallery. It was in Blockhouse. What was it called?
Wild Goose Chase?
Yeah, thank you. And then he had a gallery with myself at the back barn of the Teaser in Mahone Bay. We had a gallery there for a long time, and it was decorated out front with a life-size statue of a giant McCaskill, which was full 7 feet 2 inches tall and all painted up, whatever kind of thing. So, and that was kind of the beginning over all. And then he wanted to he wanted to go further, so he kept writing articles about it. And I think the Carol Collins had a magazine. I think it was Canadian Antiques and Art Review, and it went around for a while. So it got highly published, and a lot of attention went to folk art, in particular Nova Scotia folk art. And Carol eventually moved here into Mater's Cove, and built a restored home in Mater's Cove, and she became quite a collector herself overall. So folk art got more and more attention. So its presence got bigger and bigger. It began, and then it grew probably more into the antique world. So all the antique dealers now, everything was now branded as folk art. So now antiques and folk art are now popping up on signs and galleries everywhere. And at that time, I think that there were a lot of people starting to begin to collect folk art. This is just prior to the festival starting, but people just had started to collect folk art, mostly through the antique world. That was kind of the connection for the folk art world. And now we see, if I jump forward to now, we see things coming out of people's collections going back into the marketplace. These are the first wave of folk art that had been bought and sold in people's collections for 20, 30 years plus, and now are coming out. The Black Sheep would be a good example. They end up to have some very, very good pieces. Nice newsletter. They articulate them well, and the price point you see coming out is quite a bit higher than what the original price point would be, but they're all good pieces. You bring some wonderful pieces out every once in a while. Not everyone, probably on a pretty regular basis, but again, it established a new range for folk art as a very high collectible. And Alan would know from Maud Lewis days, quite a collectible thing. It started out at, I think the original one I bought was $1.50. And
Mine was 10.
see, you got caught in inflation. And I wouldn't hazard a guess what the average mod sells for now. What was the one that the truck went for in the auction in Ontario?
350,000.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. So again, the folk art world has changed amazingly through the years overall. And then we started the folk art festival. That was one of Chris's big things. He had a lot of these folk artists, but at some point he had no way to kind of dispense all this material. So his idea was to bring them all together. And this was the first little poster of the first folk art festival. And it brought them together. I think there were 20 artists in the first year from all over Nova Scotia, and they were the best of the best. They really were. If you were there in those early days and bought at the show, you got some incredible buys and you got some incredible pieces. The folk art was really good, and there's a great photograph around of that. And I always feel bad because one of the folk art wives, Julia, is always pissed because her husband was left off the edge of the photograph, and every time I see it now, she's taped it on the side. His picture on the side of the photograph. So it's hilarious, but it was a who's who thing, and Bernie.
And he's the only one still at the festival.
What's that?
That's Bradford. You're talking about being taped on the edge of the first photo of the first festival.
Yeah.
And he's the only artist in that photo that is still at the festival.
It's still going.
35 years later.
Yeah, born in 1948, Campertown. And Chris and Bernie Reardon was the other. Bernie was head of the art gallery in Nova Scotia at the time, and really a quite spirited guy around collecting the folk art. And he got the province buying folk art, so they built up quite a serious collection of folk art. Unfortunately, they don't show it very much, and that's really a sad thing to see that we don't really get to see. I think Maud Lewis is probably the best expression they have some time of certainly some showings and of hers, but that's probably, it's few and far between the amount of folk art that they do have overall. Hopefully times will change when the new museum gets here in Lunenburg. So we had, the first show went on, and it was just kind of a right on the picnic ground. Some had on tables, some stuff was on the ground. Had an auction, he auctioned off a few pieces. It was kind of a fun day. The Soho Kitchenman from Halifax at that time, Tom, had a wonderful little food thing running there, so it was really quite a nice day. And the volunteers, all 6 of us were running around, we did everything. And I remember one of the funny stories for me was that I was first one on site and I was the last one to leave. Not that I wanted to be the last one to leave, but what happened was it was a hot day, and I had no place to get out of the sun, and it had rained before us. It was one of those moisty days, so I had rubber boots on, shorts, and the first thing I found is that I got a ring around my leg, a rash around my legs. Every time I walked, it was just like this rash thing. So that by the end of the day, that was not very comfortable overall, even when I rolled the boots down. But as everybody was packing up and rolling up the tents and stuff like that, I went and jumped in my van, and 2 hours later, I finally left the grounds at.
Was it in Kingsburg or?
No, it was in Blockhouse. It was the parish church hall for the Anglican church, and we had it there for 3 years. And at the end of 3 years, it was risk taking to have it outdoors, because now we have more artists, more people involved, and so we needed to ensure that we weren't going to get rained on. So it was pretty risky, and that's really why we moved into Lunenburg, was the risk, because it got so much bigger. I think in the first year our sales were about $12,000. Our bills were probably about $19,000. So we didn't cover much. And in those days, Chris gave each of the volunteers a bill. So my bill was $1,100 some for the first festival. So we actually all chipped in. That's how the festival, the first 3 years, took 3 years to kind of break even, and then we hired Robin and Pat to do some work on the side for us to help us along, because again, we were all volunteers. That was a lot of fun. There was a lot of energy there was a lot of excitement around the festival. There was really good food. I must say that the Soho Kitchen those days served some incredible meals, and they ran out of food every year. It was just like clockwork. The auctions were a lot of fun. Chris being as aggressive an auctioneer as you could possibly be, always. And if you weren't paying enough, he'd let you know you weren't paying enough. So he'd be on your case. He said it's worth a lot more than that. And I think many of us who know Chris would experience that in many times over. So whether it was an antique auction or whether it was the folk art. So that's where the folk art portion of that auctioneer kind of came in overall. And we started off, I think the entertainment, Lorna Higgins and friend, which was Shirley, they started almost off in the first year, and they were all the way through till a couple years ago. Yeah. So that standard little kind of country little classic was wonderful overall. Pat and Robin left the festival in 2001, so we were just back to a volunteer group, and that's when we really formalized the society. I think in 2001 was when we formalized and got the heritage, got our society in order, and then we decided that we're all volunteers. We're not going to keep doing this unless we have a dedicated group that's going to look after it. So we looked around actually for a variety of organizations that could do it, and the one we in our minds chose, I think, was influenced by one of our our board members at the time, Nancy Ives, said it should be the Lunenburg Heritage Society. So we trotted off to see the Lunenburg Heritage Society and said, if you want to run the festival, you can run it and you can keep the proceeds. We don't want any you can use the proceeds to put back into your organization to help your organization out. It wasn't an easy sell, by the way. It was hard. Council was against it. I think town council was against it at the time. But eventually I think it came around and it all seemed to fall in place. And it really, I think, was a very good marriage. And I think the volunteers that the Heritage Society brought forward were incredible. The teams, like, weren't not just volunteers, huge teams of people, like amazing how many people kind of came out and came forward to be a part of that overall. And then I think it was 2002 was when we made the switch over to the format that the society stayed. And I unfortunately was still there. I was elected way back, literally over 30 years ago. It was ridiculous. I've been around that long. It's just disgusting, actually. I want to shoot myself for thinking about that. There is the first layout of the first time we're in the festival was in the Lunenburg Arena. It was kind of fun to watch it. We actually only had 32 artists, so we actually could include an area for the auction. We could have a food area court down here, and had spaces around the outside, but everything could be totally 100% of the inside, which was a luxury, nice to have. So, but it kept growing after that, and it's still growing as I can see overall. I wanted to mention, I forgot to mention the progression of some of the artists. Maybe I should touch on that now. So this little series of ducks and so on along here is actually, no, thank you. It actually is a lifetime work of a carver, Joshua Zink from Blandford. And you can actually, if you look at them, you'll see the different refinement as it goes along. Particularly noticeable will be the tail. You see the tail, the fattening of the body. So that's this last year. Actually, I think there's one more. I think we have one more large one. Yeah, there's a lot more of these. We have a lot more of these. But this is the evolution of this man's carving through his entire life. And it's the only person that came across that I could actually say that we actually have something. You could probably do the Nautilus, but you could probably get the rooster in day one and 20 years later would still be the same rooster. So, but this was an evolution of this artist as he had carved through the centuries. And this was actually the first index folder that we had for the folk art festivals. We moved into the arena in Lunenburg overall. So I'm going to stop now and turn to you guys and say you must have some questions. Inga.
Sorry, you were saying the first festival that consisted of 20 really fine folk artists. Was there one that stood out above the others?
Oof. Yes, there is, and it's Kay Britton, and I'm trying to think of his name.
Sydney Howard was there.
Yeah. Probably Sydney Howard would have been the one I would have liked the best. And there's some amazing stuff though. That would be like hard to choose. You know, what's going to be your last meal? Like, it's really hard because there were so many good people at that time. And I think the other time that for me too, it was a real education because it showed the depth and the variety that you would actually see, and that evolved, I think, through the years. Like, I wasn't keen about hooking because it was very craftal, but then all of a sudden I found these wonderful rug hookers that did these amazing, their own stuff, because most of the rugs in Nova Scotia that were hooked were actually done by patterns out of, I think they're blue nose patterns by Garrett's in the Glasgow, where I had most of the rugs, but all of a sudden these wonderful little mats start to come out, and people had like a clothesline, like Tiana Fitzpatrick with another one from Amherst, wonderful stuff that was being done overall. So yeah.
I want to ask you about Chris. I think that's the Chris we talk about. Is it? What did he see in those
original 17 pieces that you said he was an antique dealer, and went out and picked those 17, did you say?
Yep.
Picked them up. What did he see in them that nobody else saw?
Well, I think one of the things he has, there's a terminology I think the antique world knows, is that someone has a good eye. And I think that just means they spot that the one thing of the 20 things, they spot the one thing of the 20 things which is exceptionally good for whatever reason. I think Chris's artistic and his background in art probably was the genesis of being able to do that. But boy, he could pick them. He just knew. He'd be driving down and he'd turn that truck off the road so fast to make your head spin. And if you're with him, your head would spin because he saw something on the side of his face, out of his eye, and he would go after down and try to buy it. So that's the.
Was he the same with antiques as he
Yeah.
was with the folk art?
Yeah, and a number of people here would know him that way. He just had an eye for everything. He really did. It's exceptional. He could spot a real cover, and the other thing he could do was he could tell a fake pretty quickly too. He also had quite an interest in not just local stuff here. He often went to France and came back with antiques from France. We bought a couple of things from him that he had bought in France, but he was so interested in other stuff too. French, I think he just liked the French culture, and it's pretty interesting and culture to be in. But he definitely had the eye, really did.
And French paintings. Yeah, knowledge of French paintings.
Oh yeah, French painting. His back room in his house down in Green Bay was absolutely stunning. He had some amazing French paintings and stuff in there, like no security, nothing. Like the door was open 90% of the time. You could walk in and pull something off the wall that'd be worth, $50 grand, like nothing. Yeah.
Would places like Swickers have any sympathy for folk art?
I don't know an answer. Alan, what do you think? Maybe Maud Lewis.
Yeah, I think he's done a little bit.
Yeah.
And sometimes I think he has been asked to appraise certain things, folk art things, and I think he's usually worked through Audrey Sanford. She's helped him out.
Yeah. I think probably more in the painting department. So I think like a Maud Lewis or Joe Norris or
Joe Sleep.
Joe Sleep would be another one, like something like that would be. I mean, a good example, as I mentioned Joe Norris, there's a good example of a folk artist that was cultivated to some degree. The cultivators were Chris and Jerry Ferguson, who was a professor at the art college, and he was quite a painter, and they both loved folk art, and they kind of found Joe Norris, and Joe Norris's early stuff was absolutely amazing, particularly if you ever owned one of his chairs or piece of furniture that was so wonderfully painted. And there's still people that paint furniture, but not like he used to do. Like the little knob in the end would have actually a little painting of a ship on it, like just unbelievable. And there are not too many of those pieces around, but they were wonderful. But what they did is they supplied him with canvases of uniformity size, all already done, ready to paint on. They supplied him with paint and some cash, and so he painted quite a few paintings. And it was really a bit of a manufacturing plant. But the interesting thing is that Joe never changed his style. He just painted what he wanted to paint, and whatever he painted, they bought. No matter what it was, he painted that way. So, but it was a bit of a production facility, and it gave him cash and let him do what he wanted to do most of the time. So that was kind of it. And you see little examples of that overall in the field. It's no different than people reproducing art, copycat art all the time. like I can't imagine how many people copycatted Maud Lewis's. I've seen more versions of that black cat you can shake a stick at. So.
Were the first few festivals that you were held, that were held, were they well attended at the first one?
They were well attended, actually. We had quite a few people for not being well advertised. We'd probably have, I think, around 500 people maybe there, and people, a lot of curiosity, a lot of tire kickers. Like these were not buyers; these were lookers more, because folk art still wasn't a thing. I would say that probably 90% of the folk art was bought by antique collectors who were in that kind of crossover area that liked the folk art overall.
Am I right in saying you didn't have to pay to get in, did you, for those first few? You just turned up. I don't think there was a fee, was there?
We did have a fee.
Oh,
It was rarely paid because it was by the driveway and you could actually just walk over the drain 20 feet away and walk in. That's what most people did. So you're mostly right there. It was pretty free. It's probably why we lost so much money.
When did it transition that the colors became more vibrant, more like Craig Noggler's? When did that transition happen from, I don't want to say dull, but
Yeah, a lot of
earthy, yes, yeah.
I would, in my mind, the way I would register, that may, again, this, different people may have different versions of it. I think the Nogglers had a big influence on colors. They were the first ones that used crazy wild colors and stuff like that. They were very bold in their stuff, and that boldness came out as other artists start to do stuff. They would be copycatting some of those colors. I remember when Leo used to make the frames, and his original frames were actually made out of birch bark. But it was too painful, it warped stuff all the time. So you start making regular wood, and he painted it to look like birch bark because it was easier and it stayed together faster. And then he started adding color and more stuff to it. I think we had a triangular frame here in the exhibition, and that was a good example of how they painted in color. So colors really started to pop out. Even Carol Sloan-White, like her colors were pretty subdued. But the Nogglers ones were pretty bright and pretty bold overall. Yeah. And I think the later folk artists knew that. The carvers and stuff that did sell well, a lot of that was color. That whimsical brightness, fun-loving, people enjoyed that overall. Yeah.
To what extent do you think people like Chris told people what to do because things would sell?
I think he was a big influencer on price. He was always pushing people to get their prices up. It's too cheap, that's too cheap. He was always, but that was always Chris. That was his business side overall. He did have some ability to push people on. Joe Norris would be a perfect example of that, how he pushed him into keep painting. And I remember being in Hams Hill Blockhouse upstairs, and there'll be a stack of Joe Norris's like that, just all stacked up. Not as bad as the ones we were talking about earlier, where a man bought a painting a week from Maud Lewis, stacked them in his attic, and 30 years later, the only one that was any good was the one on the top. All the rest of them stuck together.
Oh.
So, that's right. Alan's crying more than all of you put together.
What do you think was going on today at the Folk Art Festival? I know you come every year as an evaluator on behalf of the organization, and you take a look at the new artists. Artists come in, they're on approval for the first year until they pass muster through the evaluators. And I just wondered, when you cast your mind over what you see, where the trend is, and is it legitimate? And are we holding our own as a folk art festival, or what would you say?
Well, I think that on the good side, there's some still good stuff coming through. I think we see that. Alan's been one of the evaluators for a number of years, and so we still see good stuff coming through. Crafty, like more skilled people that have skill sets versus an artist like most of these who don't have a really skilled set, have a skill set and are influenced by the look of folk art. And a good way to see that actually is in hook rugs. Very good rug hookers have some amazing designs that are very folk arty. They look wonderful, and you can't help but like them. It may not be the true blue folk art, but in actual fact, they're just so wonderfully done, and the colors and everything are so nice together. So we see a lot of that. There's still some more crafty stuff there in the festival, and you can tell which ones they are, and some of it sells. Like people like to buy things they like to buy. That's it. We all have our own taste, and we're gonna buy what we like. Period. That's how it's gonna go. But overall, and it's evolving too. Like I said, like we're seeing things shift in what was folk art. From the first folk art festival to the existing folk art festival, there's a big shift. You know, you can't find those original traditional artists. That's all they do. For most of those people, that's all they did all their lives. Someone had a secondary job, but there's still people around that had a job who might have worked for the power company that actually ended up to be a very primitive but nice carver. So there's still people like that, and there's still room for it. And I think there's still room for the evolution of it, and stuff still pops up, you know. And I think the other thing that you're probably going to find you're going to see yourself in as you're also going to be reselling work. I think you're going to be reselling. There's thousands and thousands of people in collections that are going to come available in the market. And I could see that the new group, the new festival could be selling some of those collections for people or pieces up from collection overall. So influenced by that way. So it's holding its own. You know, it has its challenges, but it's still there, and it still draws one hell of a lot of people. You know, so.
I know you said that the original description of folk art has expanded, but I think that, especially as nowadays, you have to be so careful what you say, but that for a description to call folk art unsophisticated would make a lot of people bristle.
Yeah.
I mean, what's unsophisticated about this?
Yeah, I agree. You won't get an argument from me overall on that one. And to some degree, some of these are very sophisticated. If you get somebody like this who has the patience to do this, that's a high degree of sophistication, if you ask me. That's amazing. It may look unsophisticated by somebody else, but in actual fact, the work that goes into it is very sophisticated overall. And it's the head they're thinking about, that one line and one dot. I tell you who was good that I liked a lot of his stuff, and we bought a lot of his paintings and carvings, was Clarence Ullenbach. And Clarence was at he was a great one, and he had the patience of Job. This man could put 3,000 dots on a piece of wood, and it would just and they were perfectly round. Like it's the amount of detail he would go in. We had game boards, we had paintings and stuff from him, and it's just shocking, the detail and sophistication. But if someone looked at it, if someone said, well, that's a primitive artist, but I'll tell you, the work that goes in is damn not primitive. Yeah.
Who are the other artists who are represented on your table, Gordon?
Deer.
The deer at the back of the...
Yeah, that's Ken Charlton.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
This chap here?
Yeah.
And this was the one piece, or?
That's the one piece, and that's the Rector family. There were a number of the Rector families. There were brothers and one cousin. They're all carvers, and they all did carvings of animals. And I mentioned earlier they did actual flat carvings that were literally like paintings, but the entire was one piece of wood. The hunter, the prey, the trees, the background, the rocks were all carved into.
Well, Calvin Woodward did that too.
Yeah.
His panels.
Yep.
Were etched or whatever.
Where was
So,
that then from, Gordon?
Rector,
Yeah.
you set up around Colchester?
Yeah.
Colchester.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And this eagle?
This is from Yarmouth. That's DeLong. E. DeLong. I can't remember what the E stands for.
Elmer.
Can't remember it.
Okay.
Elmer.
Yeah. But he did a lot of nice carvings. All birds, generally speaking. Never seen them in a folk art place. Bought everyone in an antique shop. And
Very sophisticated.
what's that?
They're very sophisticated.
Yeah. But fine detailed carving on all of them. You know, the eagle's carving is not fine, but the detail pattern in the wings and stuff is very, very fine. And all his birds were like that. DeLong, what's the first name? Anyway, they'll still pop up. I still see them every once in a while in an antique shop, and every time I see one, I buy one. But never, I've never seen them in folk art galleries. Never been like a part of folk art society or anything like that. So.
And this one was again?
I have no idea.
Oh, you have no
If-
idea?
If you know, let me know.
No, I don't know, but I just thought maybe earlier you had said.
But it was a good example of
Yes.
one that was not part of the folk art world, but part of the antique world.
Antique,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
I think, yes, as you say, you can still see that today, the antique collection with something.
So originally, they didn't sign their pieces then?
A lot of people did. A lot of people did. Um, some of the artists did, like you'll find some of the artists, like some of the inaugural pieces, some of the early inaugural pieces have no signatures on them whatsoever. And even some of the first Joe Norris's never had a signature on them. But eventually either they were encouraged to put it on or they put it on. The worst I used to hate was the inaugural boys used to put it on in marking pen. And of course, the sun and the marking pen don't work together. They just fades away eventually. So you get an unsigned carving every once in a while if you have it in the sunshine. So
And I don't think it's wrong, at the festival, periodically, we end up finding pieces that aren't signed, but they're on someone's table, so
Yep.
we ask them
Yep.
to please sign them.
yeah, there was a lot of early folk art though that you would have found in antique shops that would not have a signature
No,
on.
no.
They just carved it, that was it, and someone gave them a few bucks for it, and that was fine for them, and they move on from that. But certainly, if you have any notoriety, like some of these, I think are signed and some are not. Yeah, some are just initial, and some aren't.
So how did you come by this? Just one at a time?
Basically, one at a time.
Finding it directly from the artist, or just
Nope.
finding them?
Well, the first group we bought was a little group
Small little group, and then we just
in
kept,
a gallery.
and then we kept buying pieces after that,
And
here
I
and
kept
there.
seeing them.
Yeah.
So are there any pieces, like any of the paintings that Maud Lewis did she always sign hers? Well, now I'm new, did she
She
always?
didn't always sign. Sometimes there is work it's unsigned. So the early pieces just tend to be signed Lewis, and Lewis goes up from the time she married Edward in 1938 until about the middle of 1965 when she becomes famous. And once she's found fame, I think people are writing to her, giving her, sending money, and would you sign your name, Maud Lewis? And so sometimes you see Maud Lewis or Maud Lewis . So all these kind of things. But usually the work that's not signed, there's enough in the painting that gives it away. It is only by her, definitely. I would say if people are really interested in, acquiring some of the older pieces of folk art, Miller and Miller, the Ontario auction house, have, I think, a couple of auctions in October, and there are pieces, I think there's at least 2 Charlie Tanners. What was the name of the person who painted down sort of Kingsburg way?
Oh, Cyril Hurdle.
Cyril Hurdle, yeah.
There's a Cyril Hurdle.
Yeah.
So,
Yes, there's some Bradford Nobras and things like that. And Pridham's is another auction house. Some of the Charlie Tanners these days, they even a small Charlie Tanner can go for quite a lot of money. I mean, I'm talking, $2,000 or $3,000. So there's definitely a track record with some of those. I think there may even be a Colin size now, but it's not.
there's several actually. I think there's
Is there?
two carvings and 4 or 5 paintings or sketches, things like that.
Oh yeah, some of the sketches a bit.
Yeah, a couple. Something like that.
Sketchy?
Definitely.
You don't see much Collins Eisenhower for sale.
No, that's right. You wouldn't know. Yeah.
Did he not produce much, or is it just?
No, never was a big producer. So that's probably part of it, and part of it that people have it already know that it's a highly collectible thing. So you're not going to be trading it or selling it off. You're going to probably hold on to it.
In the Miller auction as well, there's quite a nice little rooster, probably 6 or 7 inches high. It was unsigned, but we've got one at home, so I knew who it was by. It's by Walter Mayette from the Eastern Shore, and that's quite a nice, nice piece, I think. Yeah.
In regard to the use of colour, I have a few pieces from the time that the Rector family painted, and most of the pieces are like you have a few there, brown and white.
Yeah.
Brown and white.
Very subdued colors, all their stuff. I don't think I've never seen, certainly we haven't in our collection, but I've not seen anything. They're very all subdued, like almost to the point where they're probably using paints they had in the house and they mix them together. So they're going to come out grayish or light. They're going to come out a very light tone. They're not going to have any brilliance to them at all.
Not car color.
Yeah, not car color.
And you were saying that the more vibrant colours didn't begin to be used until the novelists appeared on the scene.
For me, that's where I tend to see that they were used, but in terms of the influence of what you saw in the marketplace, most people would do a carving and paint it pretty plainly. But now, if they're doing a carving or doing iron work or whatever, there's a lot more boldness I think you see in their color. Yeah, I remember the first year there used to be a metal guy that was in our folk art festival, and he came to Lunenburg, and the first year he came with wonderful, interesting stuff. He made stuff out of iron, like pieces of hoe and rakes and stuff like that, and he'd turn them into turtles and a variety of different things, and they were very plain in color. And he did sell, he was very successful. Next year he had lots of color in it, everything sold. Next year everything sold. And then he got so busy up there he never came back to the festival because he could sell enough overall. But color does, I think that's part of the attractiveness to some people, is that it's that bright smile, it brings you, it's fun loving, it's really whimsical, it's really nice.
Especially in Long Island.
Yeah.
How did you convince the first festival you had? How did you convince the carvers or the artists to come and display their things?
That was all Chris. Yeah, they didn't have a hope in hell of saying no. Yeah, there's no way that there. He had a charm about him, and everybody loved him and he'd bought a lot of pieces from all of these people, and he paid good money for them, so they were all liked him, and yeah, and they were hoping to see more value. And the other thing is the first chance they ever had to show off their work in public, and many of those people, they sold their works one at a time. No one had ever sold 3 or 4 or 5 pieces in one day, so that's like a month's salary or 6 months for some of these people. So it was a big thing.
This gentleman over here.
That's no gentleman.
I have a tape that I got one time, a video I guess, from the main public channel in Maine, which I still watch quite a bit, the Antique Roadshow, I think it's broadcast through that. But they, one time, did a story on old barns that were beautiful, round barns, octagon barns, and the tape's called Barn Again. And it's really quite comical, but they were asked one time, they asked a lot of the people that had these barns, why do you always paint your barn red? So they said, well, really the only reason I guess is when we go to get some paint at the store, red barn paint is quite cheap, it's quite economical, it's less than many other colors. So then they went to the store, and they said, why is it that you can sell the red paint, so cheap? And they said, well, because that's what all the fellows with barns are doing. And I always like that.
Could I ask a question about folk art in Nova Scotia versus folk art in other parts of Canada? I don't know whether it's just because when we sort of came to Nova Scotia several decades ago, we sort of fell in love with it. Is there more of a presence of folk art here than elsewhere? Is it different from, if we were to go to another province or another area of a province, would we find the same excitement about folk art, the same sort of presence of folk art, the same desire to collect it and so on as appears to be here?
No, I don't think you'd find it. There are pockets across Canada where it's true, but I think here it's been highlighted. And it's had a lot of attention in media. I mean, the festival, just look at the lineup of the people that would draw. I couldn't imagine that. There's lots of folk art across Canada, lots being done. We actually used to take some folk art from some New Brunswick carvers and some hookers from New Brunswick that we used to use at the festival. And we don't anymore. This is a good book to show you what's the Nova Scotia one, and this one is a good book to see what's happening in Canada where you compare. But what you will find is that per capita, per size, Nova Scotia has a wealth of folk art, and it has and probably still has to some degree.
Why do you think that is?
You know, when I was talking today, I actually asked myself one question. I said, what happens if folk art never evolved here like it did? Like, what if Chris Cumming hadn't come along? Where would this be? And I suspect the answer to that question, would be we're just like everybody else. There'd be folk artists out there, but they would be doing one piece at a time, and they would sell the odd piece in here, but they wouldn't have a venue to go collectively to sell pieces, or where they get influenced by it or promote it or whatever. There was no such thing as somebody having a business card for folk art. As a matter of fact, the first one I saw was Leo Nogler, and it was about this big, and he had about 20 of them on pieces of cardboard. He painted all over the cardboard, and that was his thing, and then turned on the back, and then he had a little map to his house. so I suspect you'd probably see what you see elsewhere in Canada. It would still be here, it just wouldn't be as pronounced as you probably would have in Nova Scotia.
Yeah, we have people that come from all provinces and from the states just for the festival.
Yep.
Are there more modelist paintings owned outside of Nova Scotia?
Ellen?
I think there's a huge amount of paintings along the eastern seaboard. I think the Americans were really sharp when Maud Lewis was concerned. You know, the ships would come from Portland, shall we say, into Yarmouth, and I'd say to myself, well, how could they possibly have gone past Maud Lewis's house? You know, they've got a cottage on the South Shore. It doesn't make sense. But then in the 1930s, the road along the South Shore was appalling. So you had to drive as though you're going to go towards the Annapolis Valley. And going towards the Annapolis Valley, you went straight past the door of Maud Lewis. And you couldn't have driven past it without stopping. You know, it was an eye-catching place, really. And then from Maud Lewis's house, then as you drive towards Annapolis Royal, then you take Route 8, which takes you across to the South Shore. So that's how people from Port Mattoon, the chaplains, managed to acquire their external house shutters for the house, 22 of them, and some other works as well. They paid 70 cents a shutter, and I know that the collection of shutters and some Christmas cards and a few other things were sold for over $250,000. Hard to believe. I should tell you a funny story about Chris Huntington and Bubba Moores.
Oh my God.
Anyway, I've forgotten the American, but he did a marvellous exhibition really based on the work that Chris Huntington had collected. It's called A Life of Its Own, and I think that really does say something about a piece of folk art, that it's got some voice to it. Anyway, the person writing the book, and you can still get it from the booklet from the Art Gallery of Nova Scotia, goes into this detail about Chris Huntington meeting Bubba Moores and saying, I want you to carve, I've forgotten whether it was a man or a woman or whatever it was, but anyway, so this Bubba Moore carves the thing, and Chris takes a look at it, and he said, look, the breasts on that are much too big, you're going to have to calm things down and everything like that. So he does that, and he shellacks it all. Chris comes along, has a look at it, and he said, you can't shellac it. If you shellac it, I'm not buying it. You've got to sand it down and paint it white. So he sands it down and paints it white, and he did I think a tiny little dog or a poodle. Now that piece of folk art, whether it was by Bubba Moores or a combination of Chris Huntington and Bubba Moores, is in the Museum of Civilization or the Museum of History today in Ottawa. And that would be a wonderful piece, but it shows the influence. And Huntington was a good influence on, fortunately Maud Lewis was dead and buried by the time he got to the province. But her husband, Everett Lewis, was still alive. Now, Everett was a strange man. All women would have felt very uncomfortable around him, He's all into sort of pinching bottoms and all this. Anyway, he would try and do work a bit like Maud Lewis. In fact, he wasn't a stupid man. People kept saying to him, have you got any work by Maud Lewis? And I think he thought, hang on a minute, I think I can do one of hers and I can write her name at the bottom. Well, of course, his printing, he could barely write. His printing is huge, so when he writes Maud Lewis, you know it's not him. You know it's him rather, and not Maud Lewis. Anyway, but I think some of Everett Lewis's work was quite reasonable. He'd have a pair of oxen, but then he'd go and put a dog right above the horns or something like that. It clearly didn't belong. So I think in 74, 75, when Huntington came to the province and he was going round, he must have made the rounds to Marshalltown, and I'm certain he told Everett Lewis what to do. What you do here, you put the dots here, you put the little dashes here, and it'll look great. Don't put anything else in. Put your oxen in. I've got an oxen one at home. It is wonderful. But it's only wonderful because of the influence of Chris Huntington.
Well, thank you, Gordon. This has been absolutely perfect. We have it all on tape.
Oh my.
So, David, thank you. I trust its work. Yes. And we'll be able to shop that around for big bucks, right?
Especially with my name on it.
And sign it, large letters.
Yes.
But thank you, yes.
You're going to mention the next talk?
Yes, next talk we hope is Alan. This is just a preview of what you just had the last few minutes. The end of the month, Alan?
Sure.
You're good?
Yeah.
I think the 30th is, are we landed on the 30th or the 22nd? 22nd's a bit uptight, huh?
It's a bit tight. I think we said the 24th is a bit tight.
And if you're on our mailing list, if we have you as members or just want to leave me your email, this is how we talk to you. We haven't gone out with public display of posters and whatnot. That will come. Anyway, thank you, dear.